We're trying to appreciate something that is monumental. And what we're trying to appreciate is that the flaw in civilization is that history is viewed as mythic experience instead of high consciousness. So all of our efforts are like building little sand castles, and every time the tide comes in, it washes everything up. And no civilizations have endured. And the one that we currently believe that we are living in is really a junkyard and a wreck. And we have traced back a poignant fulcrum. Maybe not the beginning, maybe not the origin, but it certainly is a fulcrum where the balance tipped the wrong way. And that balance tipped the wrong way 2,500 years ago. And the place that it tipped was in classical Greece. And 500 years later, it tipped again as if it were caught in a cycle. And instead of it just being a danger to the Aegean Sea area and Greece and a little bit of the Asia Minor coast, this time it involved the Roman Empire and the entire world, from Ireland to India. And the great historians of both those areas, both those eras, pinpointed exactly what the difficulty was, but had no solution for it. In the Greek experience, it was Thucydides in his Peloponnesian War, and in the Roman experience, it was Tacitus in his Annals of the Roman Empire, of Imperial Rome, separated by about 500 years. And we've seen that Tacitus especially, a very careful historian, a Roman general, classically educated, a tough guy. Tacitus's Latin is the most elegant, blunt language you can imagine. I remember in high school, after the fourth year of Latin, we were allowed to translate Tacitus, and it was like trying to translate a prize fighter who was always delivering knockout phrases about every paragraph. And you had to get your Latin exactly right to be prepared for the impact. And what Tacitus shows in his writing style is a pugnacious revulsion against something which has made the strongest people inept and made the most courageous people impotent. And he says there are cycles to history, and that every 500 years, in a cycle of the phoenix, as if some great round has come around again, everything that has been built crashes. And you have to start from the beginnings, from the ruins, like the phoenix has to rebirth itself from the ashes of the old. And that the phoenix comes out of Arabia. It comes out of the Middle East. And in our own time, we have seen that we fall exactly in the cycle of the phoenix again. Exactly on time. What is going on, we are asking. What we have discovered so far, and this is History 4, in the first 3 presentations, is that without our learning by phases, there is no way to know where we are. Part of the difficulty was that learning was put into subject categorization 2,500 years ago. Before that, a person's maturation was a maturation of like being apprenticed to somebody who was fully matured, and the apprentice would be brought full into maturity. But about 2,500 years ago, education in classical Athens was portioned out by experts in certain areas, and they became subjects. And then it all became codified by Aristotle. So that then education was taken away in two different ways from its ancient wisdom origins. The first way was the categorization by subjects rather than learning by whole person. And the second was the transference of the responsibility of education to the state and not to the fathers or to a mentor. The mentor was replaced by the professional hired by the state to make sure that the subjects that were taught were useful to the state. And so lives, especially of men, were carefully honed so that they fit like gears into the machinery of the state. And that the state then represented what in Greek was called the telos, T-E-L-O-S. The telos is the purpose point towards which all action and all growth leads. And literally, we still have the phrase, do you get the point of it? The point of it is that you must have everything honed so that it comes to a point. Get to the point. And so the progress is not by maturation, but by facility to carry your debate, your argument, to victory at that end point, at that purpose point. And so what you have here is a cone of authority. And the cone of authority acclimates everyone to gauge where they are as identical to who they are. And the closer you get to the top of the power cone, the better off you are. But the point of the cone can only be one person, can only be the emperor. So that the state literally rests in the person of the emperor who, after Julius Caesar, considered himself in the Roman Empire divine. He was a god. This became an exasperating problem, and Tacitus is the historian who was there, who lived through this, lived through to see all of the devastation happen not just once, but many times with two great crises. In the first century, the Roman Empire had an enormous crisis in 68-69 AD. 4 different powerful men tried to be emperor in that year, and all of them were wrecked by circumstance. They were unable to hold a stability, unable to have a point. And so the entire empire in that year became haunted because who is going to be the 5th person to try and do this? But the 4th person who came in had a special little ploy. His ears had been up because he had been posted in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and his name was Vespasian. And he was not a Caesar. His family lineage were the Flavians. And he figured out, in a very special, subtle way, that the Caesar line was poisoned, literally. We would say today radioactive. That someone could be a Caesar in office, but not a Caesar in blood. And saw that there needed to be a new dynasty. It must be his, the Flavian dynasty, which he set up. And he had 2 sons, one of them named Titus and the other named Domitian. And Titus, who had co-ruled with his father Vespasian for a number of years, took over for about 1.5 years after his father died, and then the younger son took over after Titus died, and for the next 15 years, the rule of Domitian was called the Reign of Terror. And it was like a replay in a deeper rut of the horrors that culminated in the Emperor Nero. Nero, who in one of his grandiloquent, mad gestures, decided to burn the old Rome down so he could rebuild it the way he wanted it. And since he was a god, he had a right to do this. He was the state, not the city of Rome. Not the people of Rome. He was Rome. And so he burnt it down. And blamed a little sect of Jewish Christians, saying they're the ones who caused all of this. In 80 AD, another big fire broke out in Rome, and it was at that time that Domitian came to power, and he said, they're back. They were trying to restart this. And so he entered upon a concerted effort that his father had initiated, not following the Neronian thing that the Christians were responsible for the fire of Rome, but that the early Christians, the Jewish Christians, were responsible for interfering with the divine powers of the Roman state and of the Roman emperor, and so they had to be hunted out. And Vespasian made sure that when he got his supernatural vision in Alexandria, and we'll come to it, how Tacitus spells it out, he had his oldest son Titus lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and finally subdued all of Judea and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, pulled the central temple down so that all that remained was today the Wailing Wall. All of this was to steal back from the haunting of the early Jewish Christians that they had somehow interfered with the old gods of the state. The Roman gods being a Latin translation of the old Greek gods. That old father Zeus, who was the emperor of the Greek pantheon, became Jupiter, who was the father of the gods in the Latin language in Rome, and the emperor was literally the Lord and master of everyone because he was the son of Jupiter. He was the son of God. But that somehow the early Jewish Christian son of God ethos, while it couldn't possibly be true, was nevertheless interfering with the way in which the divine God power was coming to the emperor and was unable to hold a stability. And this is why there was intrigue after intrigue after intrigue. And finally, Domitian realized, we are rebuilding Rome from scratch, and it still is not working. We have destroyed Jerusalem. It is still not working. So there is a loose wire in this Jewish Christian community. Who is the most conspicuous leader of that community? This was about 92 AD, and he found that one of the apostles was still alive. His name was St. John. And so Domitian had St. John brought to Rome and arrayed before him in all of his imperial power. And when St. John was brought, he crackled with such an intensity of not just visionary consciousness, but of a higher, almost supernatural historical consciousness that opened into a new form. Visionary consciousness opens to the form of the spiritual person. But when it's really handled consciously, historical consciousness opens into the spiritual cosmos. And right before Domitian and his court holding power of the world, St. John literally poked a hole through their power by just the incredible presence of his historical and visionary consciousness. And so Domitian feared to kill him. So he exiled him to what he thought was the perfect silencing place. He silenced St. John by forbidding him to talk to anyone and exiled him to the island of Patmos. Now, Patmos is about 30 miles off what today is the coast of Turkey. It was then called the Roman province of Asia Minor. And the big city that's there is Miletus. And Patmos is just a rocky outcropping of an island shaped like a ship, so that it's a stone ship that doesn't go anywhere. And St. John was exiled to Patmos, and it's on the island of Patmos that he wrote the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, which is a very curious thing because it is a telescoped apocalypse. The outer part is by St. John, but the inner part is by another John, John the Baptist. That St. John was the holder of the lineage, so that he was the only one that held the writing of the early apocalypse by John the Baptist. And how that comes to be is a very powerful story. What happened in 96 AD, about a year after St. John finished the apocalypse, Domitian was exiled. He was assassinated by his only courtiers. He never hung out in the Senate. He always had his own court because he suspected that the Senate would be against him like they had been against Julius Caesar, had been against many of the other Caesars. But it was his own court, his own courtiers, who assassinated him. And he was replaced by a very old man named Nerva. And as soon as Nerva came in, he was on his last legs. He was just an interim choice. Nerva adopted the most calm, equanimous, courageous general that the Romans had seen for maybe 100 years. His name was Trajan. And Trajan is one of the most startling figures in ancient history. He ushered in what was called the Golden Age. And you can see in the severity and honesty of his physiognomy and his character, one of the great figures in world history. A figure who brought back into play again what Augustus Caesar had brought into play in the first place. That the emperor must not be the end point of everyone's lives, but he must be the first point in helping them have better lives. And so the word that Augustus used for that first citizen who helps everyone have a better life, that person was princeps, number one. And the shortened form of that, when written on Roman coins, is Princ, from which we get the word prince. That the ruler is a prince among men who leads the power so that everyone has a better life. Trajan was called optimo princeps, the perfect prince. Not because he was like a perfect prince in a Cinderella fairy tale. He was the perfect prince because he made available all of the functions of power so that persons could find a way to mature themselves through this whole structure, not beggaring the state of talented men, but allowing for talented men to be developed so that their own persons would develop along the lines of ancient wisdom. This was a revolution. Tacitus takes us through the two eras of the greatest crisis. The madness that began right after the death of Augustus Caesar. His adopted son, Tiberius, who was quite a mature man when he took over. Tiberius was the daughter of the wife of Augustus, the second wife, Livia. Not really his own son, but his adopted son. And as long as Tiberius was under Augustus, who had ruled part-time and full-time for 57 years, Tiberius was always the good son, the good Roman. But as soon as he became emperor, his entire quality of political superstition began to etch at his self-confidence, to eat away at his trust, and he became more and more subtle and sly in this kind of vicious way of letting people have enough rope till they became completely entangled, and then he would pounce and make them kill themselves. He didn't much get enjoyment out of killing, but he got great enjoyment out of having someone commit suicide because they had offended the God of the state. You have offended me, and so you have offended the entire structure of what is real. You are unreal. You must kill yourself and help us purify the state. This was something that leached into the Caesar line, and every Caesar after that became worse and worse. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, was so insane that he was killed within 4 years. He's the one that made the famous statement that he would rather give the empire to his horse than to some other man. And then Nero followed him. The second crisis was with the Flavians that ended with the terror of Domitian. What we're trying to appreciate and understand here for ourselves is that we are caught in the same wheel that is grinding us up in the same way, and that 500 years ago it was seen again 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell apart in about 500 AD. About 500 years after Tacitus, it fell apart permanently, and the Dark Ages came in. 500 years ago, that cycle of the Phoenix was covered by one of the most perspicacious historians who ever lived, and his name is Machiavelli. And his famous book is called The Prince, the man at the top. But the Prince is just the point of a cone of power that his discourses on Livy, another great Roman historian, so that the whole cone of authority, Livy takes the history of Rome from its founding all the way to 9 BC, because in 9 BC, two extraordinary things happened. Augustus built the Ara Pacis Augusta, as we talked last week, where the Via Flaminia comes into Rome from the north of Italy, like the Via Appia. The Appian Way comes in from the south, the Flaminian Way comes in from the north. And where they meet, where they come into Rome, are the power places that lead to the point of the Roman state, the point of the empire. And the point of the empire is a marker in the center of the Roman Forum. And that marker was point stop for all the roads in the world. All roads lead to Rome. They all lead to that one marker. If you control the roads, you control everything. At the top of that entrance into Rome is the Ara Pacis Augusta, the Temple of Eternal Peace of Augustus, where all the power was brought to peace, to equanimum. And the equanimum is because Augustus adopts as his context for handling the empire right, Tellus Mater, Mother Nature. And in the temple of eternal peace, there is a frieze against the back wall. And it is Mother Nature with all the bountifulness of happy children and cornucopias and happy people. And then the frieze has Augustus and his wife Livia and his great general and architect Agrippa and all the power people in Rome at the time, sculpted in frieze, going outside along the inside of the temple, and then on the outside, all the lesser officials who in that frieze are just the way that they would have been of bringing all their power there and presenting it to Augustus, seated before the frieze of Tellus Mater, Mother Nature. All of this is to say, nature leads to unification. And the justification for this goes back to the Greeks. And the codification of this goes back to two Greeks, one in the 500s and one in the 300s BC. The one in the 500s BC was one of the first really powerful tyrants in Athens. His name was Pisistratus. And the second is one of the most powerful philosophic minds of all time, Aristotle. There were many people who were able to mitigate Pisistratus in the next 100 years or so. And I'll talk about one of the most powerful of them in just a moment. But when Aristotle came in, there was hardly anyone to mitigate him because his star pupil was Alexander the Great, who said, I have understood what it is to be not only an emperor of all the kingdoms, but to be the uniter of the entire human family and be the king of the entire human family. He called that the ecumene. We get ecumenical out of it. By the ecumene, he meant to extend his rule over the entire world. He took it as far as India and left cities all the way through Central Asia and the Middle East, and was coming back to swing the other way, to go all the way to Ireland and the northern Scandinavian countries. When he fell ill and he died, he was about 32 years old. But it was his teacher, Aristotle, who codified everything in a very tight way, showing that it was completely natural for any reality to come to a unifying thing and for there to be a single person who unified the unity, who guaranteed the unity of everything and had a right to power, and that the body extension of themselves was the state. So that in Aristotle, for the first time, you find the doctrine, the state has the right to educate people the way it wants to, because they belong to it. This is in two documents that are related, that survive. One is called the Athenian Constitution, and the other is called the Politics. Aristotle was one of these confident later Greeks who had come after 200 years of genius and thought it was time for somebody to tie all this together. And so he considered himself the one who was going to tie it all together. So he had a number of his students search out the constitutions of all of the cities that were in the Greek world. The total number was 168. The only one that has survived pretty much intact, it's missing the first 6 pages, is the Athenian Constitution. And after he had these specimens of political power, then he wrote the Politics to give you what the scientific form of political power is, based on examining the different cases of it. And so Aristotle's Politics, for the very first time, cinches a philosophy of politics in a way that he says is scientific. And out of that comes the phrase political science. Before him, the critique was always that the higher resonances of human beings are spiritual, they are supernatural, they're not limited by nature. With Aristotle, all the higher resonances now become suspect, and they must be brought back into line with the mind. And the mind must learn to put aside childish things, or superstitious things, or odd or weird things, and get back to practical things. Get back to the way in which things are done, that you feel about them, that you have images of them, and how that all comes together in the ideas that you have of them. And if your ideas are correct, they will agree with the way that the state has determined through long millennia of experience, and we now know exactly what to do. And if you will pay attention, you will learn and you will be successful. And this will constitute for yourself, the word in Greek is eudaimonia, it means the good life. You will fit in and you will have a good life. And because you will fit in with everyone else, what problems could you have as long as those of us who run the state are left to run it? And we will run it right because we will have the power and we will have your cooperation. Not just your cooperation on decision, but you will belong to us like the threads of a fabric because we will have woven you from birth to be this way. Now you can see that the alternative to this becomes profound in the sense of not just changing the images on the fabric, or not just changing the way in which the fabric is woven, but to not weave that kind of fabric at all. And the founder of that was Pythagoras. Pythagoras, who had studied in the ancient Heliopolis center of Egypt for 22 years, had studied in ancient Iran for 11 years, and after 33 years, came back to his home on the island of Samos, not far from Patmos in the Aegean Sea, and found that he could not teach anyone there because there was no one to hear him. His only student for a while was a star athlete whom he paid to come and get lessons from him. And after 3 years told him, I don't have any more money. And so the top athlete decided that, well, maybe I'll pay him. But Pythagoras left Samos and went to the Wild West of the early Greeks. This is 500 BC. He went to southern Italy to a place called Crotona and set up what has always been called a utopian colony. But what it was his maturation of wisdom, brotherhood of people, men and women. And for the very first time in human history, you had a human wisdom maturation community that had both men and women who were equal with each other in the maturation. So that one of the telltale marks, which you do not find in early Buddhism, you do not find it in Taoism, you don't find it in Judaism. The only place that you find it in the early testing of it is in the Pythagorean mystical communities. One of the prize students of Pythagoras was a woman named Diotima, and she was the teacher of Socrates. So that Socrates is a grandson of Pythagoras through the spirit mother of Diotima. The place in Plato's dialogues where you can find Socrates giving that story is called the Symposium. And what Diotima conveyed to Socrates was a kind of a wisdom that the maturation of someone needs to go not just to the natural limit of unity, but needs to branch out again into an opening to another realm. And that world is not a realm that comes to a point, but that point is not a stopping place, but is a transformed place. And when that transformed place is open, the transform works, and the other world, the higher world, opens up. But it opens up in such a way not to go back to a second unity, but to open indefinitely, so that while the natural world likes unity, the spiritual world likes infinity. So in the natural world, you can work with a binary of 0 and 1, but in the spiritual world, you work with 0 and infinity, which is a different set, and it doesn't set itself as a binary, but it sets itself as a kaleidoscope. And so visionary consciousness, as we have seen, is kaleidoscopic. Now one has what Sri Aurobindo used to call the mind of light. Not just that the mind is suddenly given enlightenment, but that light also has the ability to be differentiated into a rainbow, so that all the colors of light are available to the spiritual consciousness. And in that gorgeous array, the simple things of this world look very much like cutouts. They don't look at all like the impressive existential things that you thought were powerful before. What's really powerful is that the cosmos has a gorgeousness of indefinite, infinite colorings, which we are able to prism. And so while the world works on the pragmatic connection between action and thought, the spiritual world works on the prismatic opening up of person and cosmos. By the time Plato learned enough from Socrates to begin writing his dialogues, Thucydides had already gone through a whole lifetime of coming to understand that power in the world, because it was based on polarities of trying to resolve it to get to single-pointedness, that this was creating intolerable tensions whenever you expanded beyond the simple tribes. Whenever you got higher than the cultural level of tribes, and you got to where you had many tribes and many cultures in a civilization, the tensions were not able to be handled by the form of civilization, and that it would always break. And so he wrote the Peloponnesian War to warn everyone, saying, we have first seen it here. Any time that these conditions happen, the same thing will happen to you. And when Tacitus read Thucydides, he realized that this was true. In Machiavelli, in the Renaissance 500 years ago, he recognized that it was true again. That Thucydides had been 2,000 years before him, and the same thing was happening. The Renaissance princes were all vying with each other to be the top again. The man on the cover of this prince is Cosimo de' Medici. We live again exactly 500 years after that, in the same cycle. This time, we must not play that Russian roulette game. Let's take a break. Let's come back. Let's come back to the foundation of imperial power, which threatens us in our lives again. This is a publication that the University of California Press did a few years ago in connection with the Getty, and years of archaeological research on the Forum of Trajan in Rome, which when it was built around 110 AD was the embodiment of the greatest power that the world had ever seen at the time. It was meant to be a bar against which all future power on an imperial scale would calibrate itself. In the Forum of Trajan, there were two great libraries facing each other across this court. One library were books in Greek, the other were books in Latin. And the books were not just books in a library, they included the state archives, the official annals of everything that happened in the kind of detail that if you wanted to have a prosecution of someone, you could look up every iota, every detail of every action of importance in the empire. So it was like a resource for Roman law to ensure that the state had full control over everything, over everyone and everything, over all persons and all situations. At the head of this court, in between the two great state archives, was the only surviving thing from Trajan's Forum, and that's Trajan's column. This enormous, broad-girthed column, at the top of which was the single man on his horse, Trajan, still there in Rome. And at the bottom of the column, there was a special place where the ashes of Trajan were brought, and they were installed in the bottom of the column. And so this became a new marker. Not the all the roads lead to the one marker at the center of the Roman Forum, but Trajan's column became the marker by which all future imperial history would be able to coordinate itself and remain coordinated. That the problem with Augustus Caesar had been that he co-opted so many ancient traditions and had so many people on his brain trust that what he constructed was rather a pastiche which his followers could not hold together. Augustus Caesar could hold it together because he was a remarkable character and because he had had a forerunner in his great uncle Julius Caesar, who was masterful at handling power. And while Julius Caesar was assassinated by his best friends because he had not just become the dictator for life over the end of the Roman Republic and not just become the head of Roman religion, the Pontifex Maximus. The Pope is the carrier of the Pontifex Maximus. It's still there. That part of the Roman Empire is still in place. But Julius Caesar was the first Roman to say that he was a god, and so he became divine Julius. And Augustus was very clever and always careful not to address himself as divine, but just to let everyone know that he was the moving first citizen and that everyone's well-being was ensured if you would help him to be a good first citizen. A later empire was set up by a man who called himself first citizen. His name was Napoleon. And only later did he have himself crowned as emperor. But it is this first point that leads that has a very esoteric ambiguity to it. When you have an Aristotelian sense that all structure leads to the purpose point, the telos, this is the point at which we get, and it's the proof that we have accomplished this. The accomplishment is the doing of ritual actions, so that all the ritual actions form a traction base upon which the experience of people in their feelings, in their images, in their language, lead to a integral interiorization of the meaning of all that into ideas, and the imagination leading into the visualization of it, and that leading to the point of all this is that you believe in the integrity of this unity. That the state has every right to have a head, and he be the head of the entire empire. And this is called the imperium. There is no room at the top for two, only one. But the challenge to that was 500 years before Augustus Caesar in Pythagoras, because the Pythagorean wisdom maturation were always communities of men and women together. And we talked about how one of the women in the Pythagorean community, Diotima, was the teacher of Socrates, and how in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, he gives the rendition of how he learned that wisdom is a penetration through many layers, veiling truth in oneself and in conversation with someone else, and in the images that swirl between two or more people, and how all of this is brought into play not by reduction, but by layers of penetration, and that these layers of penetration reveal at each stage closer and closer that the swirl of many things becomes a lesser swirl of fewer things, and eventually becomes just a tension between two things, and the resolution of that to something which is not divisible. That is the truth. The Greek word for it is aletheia. That truth is discoverable by a process of dialogue, and that as long as we both are together in the pursuit of truth, we will not come to a purpose point of karmic action based on experience. We will come to a moment of clarity that is open and allows both of us to transform together into a higher realm, into a spiritual world where infinity in its rainbow coloring is the point. It isn't a point then, it is a cosmic threshold of complete openness forever. So that one doesn't come to the good life, one comes to eternal life. It's a completely different thing. The Pythagorean tradition was always marked by men and women sharing together. One of the inheritors of those Pythagorean communities was a talented man. We do not know his name, but we know that in 160 BC, he was the high priest in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and that Judea was a part of the great empire of Antiochus IV, who, being a good Hellenistic Greek king, and Rome is just the most successful of the Hellenistic kingdoms, Antiochus IV wanted himself worshipped in the temple. And so by threats, if you do not do this, you will die. By bribes, if you do this, I will reward you. He took over the temple in Jerusalem, and the high priest left in a self-exile and wandered for 20 years. What is going on? What does all this mean? We never know his name, but he comes down in history. The Jewish phrase translates as the teacher of righteousness. Melchizedek. Not Melchizedek, Melchizedek, the teacher of righteousness. And he, after 20 years, founded the Essene community on the Dead Sea, not up in Jerusalem in the temple, which was Hellenistically taken over, but a new practical ascetic community of people who were trying to learn an active life that would allow for them not to be co-opted and caught up in the imperial grind gears that was reducing everyone down to this imperium. We know because the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found contain the documents, the books that tell about the founding of the community, about the teacher of righteousness, and contain a sheaf of his spiritual poems. In Hebrew, they're called hodio, and they are called, in English translation, the Thanksgiving hymns. And when you read the Thanksgiving hymns, you realize for the first time that there is a special quality to spiritual maturity. And the special quality is that one has gone through one's mind into the openness of the spiritual person, and that the spiritual person is always spontaneous. They are the artist of life, the artist of themselves. And so a fully mature spiritual person can create a spontaneous poem of praise of God, can create a hymn immediately. And this is one of the proofs of their spiritual resonance, that they're able to take language into a praise poetic and offer that to God. And so the Thanksgiving hymns of the teacher of righteousness in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a sheaf that shows us the maturity by about 130 BC of that Essene community, and all of a sudden you find that there is a complement to the active Essene community outside of Alexandria called the Therapeutai. That while the Essene community on the Dead Sea is the active life artisans who became carpenters like Joseph, who had scriptoriums where they would write books, but the Therapeutai outside of Alexandria were the contemplatives. And it was a contemplative retreat from the world, one of the few in the world that had men and women together equally. And though the men and women were recognized to have their own concourse of modes of life, they would be brought together every 7 days in a particular way. They would hear someone who is the president of the community speak in a very special way. We know because there is a fragment of the book that records it personally by Philo called On the Contemplative Life. And he says that everyone arranges themselves and that a curious thing happens. There is a silence within silence that occurs. It isn't just the silence, but within that silence is another silence. And that when the teacher speaks, his language echoes through the two silences so that the words become engraved on the souls of the hearers, so that they not only have ears to hear, but they have life to live it. Be doers of the word. And he says this teacher that he saw was young, because it's not necessarily the oldest person, it's the most special person that has this ability to teach this way. And that in his time, about 25 AD, he heard this teacher teach in this way. And that when he was finished, the crackling scintillation of the spiritual energy was released in a community hymn, which the men and women would sing together in an antiphon, where the women would carry a certain phrase and then the men would respond with another phrase, so that you would get a community singing of praise dialogue spontaneously, and that God loved this music of the spheres. And of course, the great figure of that community was Jesus. And the great feminine companion was Mary Magdalene. And one finds in the Odes of Solomon that we took a couple of months ago, you find a sheaf of 42 Odes of Solomon that, again, like the Thanksgiving hymns, are the spontaneous hymns of praise of Mary Magdalene, delivering the shared presence harmonic that one had learned from Jesus of how to do this. And because it was differentially open, it was available whenever two or more are gathered in my name, I will be there. Now you have a different basis on the ecumeny. Now humankind has a harmonic rather than an imperium. It has an openness into infinity rather than a closedness to a point of purpose. But the educations are totally different. One is to mature you through your mind into your spiritual capacities. The other is to limit you to the ideology of the perfectly balanced mind, where you do what is expected of you and everything will be all right. One leads to behavior or punishment. The other leads to transformation and open learning. This is a learning education. One of the qualities that we have found in Thucydides and Tacitus is how if you take pairs, if you take a book by itself, you get caught in textville. You get caught in explication of textness. But if you pair books, all of a sudden you get a tunable ratioing, and you get a different quality of mind. Instead of a mind that goes into a kind of a behavior modification, you get into a mind that learns how to learn. By re-ratioing, I used to call them ratios of the real. And by learning how to re-ratio, you learn that what's important is not obedience to empire. It's not even revolution against empire, but it is recalibration of your maturity. And when you can recalibrate, now you have two faculties that are indispensable. You have creative art of person capable of critiques to refine it even more so and appreciate it. And you have a historical consciousness that allows for an analytic to develop science. So that the arts and sciences are now a part of the larger infinite scalar of human capacity. An empire will always truncate the arts and sciences, will always co-opt history into a mythology, and will always limit the mind to what the ideological doctrines expect, and that, therefore, the rituals of action must have an identity correspondence with them. This is like making a virtue out of being trapped by karma. It is patently absurd. It is not really sustainable at all. And it has been the cracking point of all civilizations, and will be if we try to make a new one in this way. It cannot be done. It's like trying to glue and pastiche something together that has to have a supple tensile strength. And what you get by that is a completely different kind of thing. You cannot make just a Roman broadsword out of your steel. You have to make like a samurai sword of folding hundreds and thousands of times so that the layers of steel structure become extraordinarily supple and able to be handled in almost eye-blinking speed. And it isn't the power of the arm, but it is the exactness of the cut that makes it possible. And of course, this reminds us of the ancient Taoist tale that Chuang-Tzu talks about, how in front of the Chinese emperor, they used to sacrifice an ox, and one day this Taoist came with his knife and very quickly cut through and prepared the ox for sacrifice. And the emperor said, "But your sword didn't need sharpening." And the Taoist said, "Well, all these men cut to cut through bone and through sinew. I cut in between everything, and so not touching anything, of course my sword is always sharp." This quality in our learning is there because we put it into a phase structure rather than a subject structure. A subject structure will always lead to the illusion of subjectivity, which is the veil that the ego uses to support its claims. Whereas the actuality, the reality is, if you go through our phase learning, you come to an openness that is superior to clarity. Because it can open openness itself. And this is a form of infinity. In 69 AD, Vespasian was in Alexandria to try to co-opt the secret energy that some mysterious religious spiritual power had developed there in Alexandria. And Tacitus gives us the story. He says, during the months when Vespasian spent at Alexandria waiting for the regular season of the summer winds to ensure a safe voyage, there occur many miraculous events manifesting the goodwill of heaven and a certain favor of providence toward him. At Alexandria, a commoner, whose eyes were well known to have wasted away, on the advice of Serapis, whom the superstitious people worship as their chief god, fell at Vespasian's feet, demanding with sobs a cure for his blindness, and imploring that the emperor would deign to moisten his eyes and eyeballs with the spit from his mouth. Another man with a maimed hand, also inspired by Serapis, besought Vespasian to imprint his footmark on it. At first Vespasian laughed at them and refused, but they insisted. He half feared a reputation for gullibility, but was half moved to hope by their petition and the flattery of his courtiers. He eventually told the doctors to form an opinion whether such cases of blindness and deformity could be remedied by human aid. The doctors discussed the question from various angles, saying that in one case the power of sight was not extinct and would return if the impediments were removed. In the other case, the limbs were distorted and could be set right again by the application of an effective remedy. This might be the will of heaven, and the emperor had perhaps been chosen as the divine instrument. So Vespasian reached down to the dust and moistened it with his spittle, put it on the blind man's eyes, and the blind could see. He touched the deformed foot, and the lame could walk. So he appropriated Jesus' miracles for himself, and on this basis was declared emperor of the world. 69 AD. This is a co-opting of vision. Not that vision can be co-opted, but what happens is that the mind seals off the openness and puts in its place not a wall, that would be too apparent, but puts in its place a mirror. And so when the mind looks to look through its transcendental point, what it sees is a mirror of itself, and out of this comes, from the habit of identification, the realization that I am who I am. And so the false self is born from irrefutable evidence in the mind. And so without a transformed mind, no one has any idea that they are not what they see in the mirror of themselves. The first of the odes of Solomon lead to the 13th, and the 13th is one of the great spiritual poems of all time. It's about 8 or 10 lines, and we'll look at it next week. What we're going to come back to next week is the jump of 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire into the Renaissance. And we're going to take for one of our books that we're going to pair, we're going to take a book called The Renaissance. The Renaissance was written by Jacob Burckhardt, but written in the 19th century, in the 1800s. Burckhardt was a friend of Nietzsche and was a professor at Basel in Switzerland. And it's his book, looking back in retrospect after 300 years, that first came to understand that there was a historical phenomena known as the Renaissance. Since then, there have been many claims that there have been many Renaissances, but Burckhardt's is the most poignant because he's the one who saw that if you get locked into the identification of man and state, you will not understand what a transformation to spirit, person, and cosmos is all about. You will mistake it because your ideological idea of it will be what is mirrored back to you. You will simply confirm what you have been told to understand, and you have your own way of confirming it by seeing that this is true in the mirror of your own identity. In this way, karma becomes maya and lies. The deepest danger is not from the threat of someone who will do you harm, but from what was called in ancient times, St. John used an ancient word, Belial, which means the deceiver, the liar. The first person to understand this was Zarathustra 4,000 years ago. He saw that there is an evil spirit, but the evil spirit does not fight, but lies, deceives. Because by deception, one can never know the truth, and one always mistakes a false illusion for the realization. And worse, believes it. And so the world slips, because of the mirrors of illusion, into delusion. And because life is lived delusionally, it never is natural. It never is spiritual. It never is real. And always must be sustained again and again by reiterations of the right rituals so that you get the right experience, so that you get the confirming right ideas. We are learning not to do that because it's a fatal bad habit. We are pursuing phases of learning. And next week we will pair with Burckhardt's The Renaissance, one of the all-time great human beings who wrote an autobiography himself, Benjamin Franklin, who decided when he was 16 years old that he wanted to learn how to learn. And the first thing that he realized is that you have to have a way to refine your own language so it comes from you, but it comes from you in such a way that it can be refined and honed. And so at 16, he borrowed a copy of a British literary magazine called The Spectator. And he would read it, and then he would rewrite the articles in his own language, and then reread the article, and then rewrite until his own language had the clarity of the literary magazine, but it was his own writing. And then to test himself out, he was 16 years old. This is in Boston. He decided to write a series of letters and signed them do good and slipped them under the door of his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant. And they were published on the front page, and all Boston was talking about this wise woman who was writing these do-good letters. And when they found out that it was 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin, they were very worried about him. What is going to become of you? You're trying to be different from everyone else. And his reply was to run away from home and go down to Philadelphia and start his own life from scratch. More next week.